The night I found out, I was standing in my own kitchen, holding a glass of water. I'd gone downstairs to get at 2 in the morning, and I couldn't move. Not because of what I saw, because of what it meant. My wife of 31 years, and my son's fiancée. I stood there long enough that the ice melted. I should back up. My name is Edmund. No, wait. People always say that at the start of these things, and it sounds stiff. Let me just tell you the way it happened. I'm 64 years old. I retired 2 years ago from 30 years in civil engineering, bridges, mostly. I spent my career calculating load-bearing capacity, stress tolerance, what holds and what doesn't. I thought I was pretty good at reading structures. Turns out I was only good at the ones made of steel. My wife's name is Nadine. We met in 1993 at a church potluck in Knoxville. She brought a green bean casserole. I brought nothing because my mother told me to bring chips and I forgot. Nadine laughed at that. She had this laugh that started slow, like it wasn't sure it was allowed yet. I fell for that laugh before I fell for anything else about her. We built a life. A real one, a house in Chattanooga with a maple tree in the backyard that I planted when our son was born. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom we added on later, a porch I built myself over the course of 2 summers, and 1 embarrassing trip to the ER when I dropped a 2x4 on my foot. Our son is Harrison. He's 33. He works in insurance. Not the exciting kind, the kind that involves a lot of spreadsheets and conference calls. He's a good man, quiet, like me. The kind of man who remembers to call on birthdays and shows up early to help set up chairs at family events. I was proud of him every single day of his life, even the days he didn't know I was watching. 2 years ago, Harrison brought home a woman named Brooke. She was from Nashville. Mid-30s, sharp dresser, worked in pharmaceutical sales. She had that quality some people have where they make you feel like you're the most interesting person in the room. And then you notice they do it with everyone. I noticed. I filed it away. I told myself it was just good social skills. Nadine loved her immediately. That was the part that should have made me more comfortable, but somehow didn't. They got engaged last spring. April. Harrison called me from the parking lot of the restaurant where he'd proposed, and I could hear in his voice that particular kind of happiness that a father recognizes, the kind that's so big the person doesn't know what to do with it. I cried in my truck for 10 minutes after we hung up. I didn't tell him that. The wedding was set for October. The summer before the wedding, things started to feel off. I don't know how else to say it. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of small things, the kind you notice and then talk yourself out of noticing. Brooke started coming by the house more, which made sense. She and Nadine were planning the wedding together, and Harrison was working long hours. I didn't think much of it. I'd be out in the garage or on the porch, and I'd hear the 2 of them inside, talking, laughing. I'd come in, and they'd be at the kitchen table with color swatches and seating charts spread out, and they'd both look up at me with that slightly impatient expression women give men who have wandered into a planning session. But there were other things. Once I came home early from a doctor's appointment. Just a routine thing, blood pressure check, and Nadine's car was in the driveway, but the house was quiet in a way that felt wrong. I called out. She answered from upstairs. Said she was resting. I went to make myself lunch and found 2 wine glasses in the dish rack. It was 11:30 in the morning. I didn't say anything. I don't know why. Maybe I was already protecting myself from what I might find out. Another time I was out back, trimming the maple tree, the one I planted when Harrison was born. And I heard Nadine on the phone in the kitchen. The window was open. She was laughing that slow laugh, the one I'd fallen in love with at a church potluck 30 years ago. She wasn't laughing it at me. I stood outside with the pruning shears in my hand, and I thought about what it meant that I could identify my wife by her laugh. And then I thought about the last time she'd laughed like that with me. I couldn't remember. I want to be honest about something. I am not a man who confronts things directly. I never have been. I'm the kind of man who notices a problem, documents it in my head, runs the numbers quietly, and comes to a conclusion alone in a room. My therapist. I started seeing one the year I retired, which is a whole other story. My therapist calls this hypervigilance followed by avoidance. She says I watch everything and respond to nothing. I told her that sounded like good engineering. She didn't laugh. So when I started to understand what was happening in my own house, I did what I always do. I watched. I waited. I didn't say a word to anyone. Until the night I went downstairs for water and couldn't move. It was a Wednesday, late August. Harrison was out of town for work, a conference in Atlanta, 3 days. I'd gone to bed early because I had a headache, and Nadine said she was staying up to watch something on TV. I woke up around 2. Headache was gone. I was thirsty. The house was dark except for the light over the stove, which we always leave on. I came downstairs in my socks, and I saw Nadine's car in the driveway, and Brooke's car. I don't know what I thought in that moment. I think I didn't think. I think my brain decided not to think on my behalf. I walked into the kitchen to get my glass of water. The kitchen opens into the living room. The couch faces away from the kitchen. They didn't hear me come in. I stood there for what felt like a very long time. Long enough for my mind to go through every other possible explanation and come up empty. Then I walked back upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I held my water glass and I thought about load-bearing structures. I thought about the calculations you make before you build something, and I thought about the calculations I had apparently failed to make somewhere along the way. Then I put the glass on the nightstand, lay back down, and stared at the ceiling until morning. I called my daughter-in-law, not Brooke, Harrison's sister. My daughter, Lena. Lena is 30 years old. She lives in Asheville with her husband and their 2 kids. She's the one in the family who sees things clearly and says them out loud, which is the opposite of me, and occasionally infuriating, and also the reason I called her and not anyone else. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was already awake. Dad. The way she said it, not a question, not a greeting, just my name, like she'd been waiting. I said, "How long have you known?" There was a pause. "Long enough to tell me everything." "I wasn't sure," she said. "I suspected. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure." I asked her what she'd seen. She told me it was more than what I'd seen. It had been going on, she believed, since at least April, since the engagement. I sat in my truck in the driveway. I'd gone outside so Nadine wouldn't hear, and I looked at the maple tree in the backyard, and I thought about the 31 years of dinners and arguments and road trips and hospital waiting rooms and property taxes and quiet Sunday mornings that had brought me to sitting in a truck at 7 in the morning being told by my daughter that my wife had been carrying on an affair with my son's fiancée. "Dad," Lena said, "don't do anything yet. Can you wait? I need to tell you something." I said I could wait. What Lena told me took about an hour. She had not been idle while I had been hypervigilant and avoidant. She had done what I apparently couldn't do. She had looked. She'd started 3 months earlier when she came to visit for Memorial Day weekend and noticed something that bothered her. She didn't tell me what it was. She said it doesn't matter now. Just know that I saw it and I knew. So she'd started paying attention. She'd had a conversation with Brooke's former co-worker, a woman she found on LinkedIn, who told her some things about Brooke's history that Harrison didn't know. She talked to a friend of hers who works in family law. She consulted, quietly, carefully, with a financial advisor. Because here is the part that made the water glass feel like the least of my problems. Brooke came from money. Or so everyone believed. She talked about her family in Nashville, her parents' house in Belmead, private school, vacations to Martha's Vineyard. Harrison believed it. We all believed it. It was part of why the match seemed so comfortable. Not because we cared about money, but because it seemed like two people starting from a stable place. Lena had found out that none of it was true. The parents in Belmead were renting. The private school was partially fabricated. Brooke had declared bankruptcy at 31, which would have been findable. It's public record, if anyone had thought to look. She'd had a previous engagement to a man in Memphis that ended abruptly 18 months before she met Harrison. The man in Memphis, according to Lena's research, had been in the process of buying a house. The deal collapsed right around the time the engagement did. I sat in my truck and I let that settle. She was going to marry Harrison, I said. Yes, Lena said. And your mother. I don't know if Mom knew all of it, Lena said carefully. I don't know how much of this was planned and how much just happened. But I know that Brooke was not who she said she was. And I know Mom wasn't being honest with any of us. And I know Harrison doesn't know any of this. I looked at the maple tree. Harrison planted a pine cone under that tree when he was 7 years old. He wanted to grow a pine tree inside the maple tree. I didn't explain to him why that wouldn't work. I just let him plant it and watched and said nothing when nothing grew. He'd forgotten about it within a week. I never forgot about it. What do you need from me? I asked my daughter. I need you to stay calm, she said. And I need you to trust me, because I have a plan, and it requires you not to blow everything up before we're ready. I said, I've been calm my entire life, and look where it got me. She said, I know, Dad. This is different. This is going to be okay. I don't know why I believed her, but I did. The next 3 weeks were the hardest I've ever lived through. I went about my life. I had breakfast with Nadine. I asked about the wedding plans. I sat across from her at dinner, and I talked about the weather and the neighbors and the knee I'd been having trouble with. And I watched her face, and I thought about all the things I didn't say. She looked the same as she always had. That was the part I kept returning to. I had expected something to be visible, some mark, some sign of the fault line. But she laughed and passed the salt and asked if I'd remembered to call the dentist, and she looked exactly like the woman I'd shared a bed with for 31 years. I wondered if I looked the same to her. I wondered if she knew that I knew. I wondered a lot of things I had no way to answer. Brooke came by twice in those 3 weeks. Both times I stayed in the garage. I couldn't look at her. Not because I was angry. I was angry, yes, but it was a cold anger, controlled, the kind I didn't trust myself to show. More than that, I was afraid of what my face would do. Harrison called from Atlanta and then from a work trip to Cincinnati. He sounded happy. He talked about the apartment he and Brooke were going to rent after the wedding, about a promotion he was being considered for, about a camping trip they were planning for the fall. I listened to him and I held the phone and I said, "That sounds great, son," approximately 14 times. I slept about 4 hours a night. Lena called every other day, short calls, careful. She was still gathering information. She'd connected with a private investigator, not for surveillance, she said, but for documentation of what they already knew. Financial records, public documents, a paper trail that told the story without requiring anyone to take anyone's word for it. On the 3rd week, she called and said, "Dad, we're ready." Harrison came home on a Friday. Lena drove up from Asheville. She arrived before he did, which was intentional. She sat at my kitchen table with a folder, an actual paper folder, the kind that feels serious, and she laid out what she had. I looked at the papers spread across my kitchen table. The bankruptcy filing, the court records from Memphis, the financial disclosures, the communication logs she'd obtained through channels I didn't ask too many questions about. There was also a printed email, one email, specific and unambiguous, that established what Nadine knew and when she knew it and that she had not told Harrison. I sat there for a while. Then I said, "She knew." Lena said, "Yes." I said, She knew who Brooke was, and she didn't tell him. Lena didn't answer that. She didn't need to. I got up and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard. The maple tree was already starting to turn. Early this year, the leaves at the top were orange, and the ones lower down were still green, and the whole thing looked like it was caught between two seasons. I planted that tree the day my son was born. I drove to the nursery while Nadine was still in the recovery room. The nurse thought I'd lost my mind. I told her I needed something to come home to after this. She gave me a look like I'd said the most inexplicable thing she'd ever heard. And maybe I had. But I went to the nursery, and I picked out the smallest maple tree they had, and I brought it home, and I dug the hole myself, still in my good shoes, and I put it in the ground. 33 years later, it was tall enough to shade half the backyard. "He has to know," I said. "Yes," Lena said, "tonight." Harrison came in around 6. He had a bag over his shoulder and 2 days stubble, and that particular kind of road trip tiredness where a person is happy to be home. He dropped his bag by the door and came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw Lena. "Hey," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" she said. "Sit down." He looked at me. I nodded. He sat down. We told him. Lena led. I sat beside her and I watched my son's face while his sister laid out the truth about the woman he was going to marry in 6 weeks. There's a particular expression a person gets when they're hearing something they don't want to believe. I've seen it in engineering meetings when a design isn't going to work. It's not quite denial. It's the moment before denial, when the brain is still running through every alternative explanation before it accepts the one right in front of it. Harrison made that face for about 30 seconds. Then it changed. He didn't cry. Not then. He just got very still. He asked 3 questions. He asked how long. He asked if it was possible. Brooke didn't know what she was doing. If maybe she'd just been ashamed of the bankruptcy and hid it without planning to deceive anyone. Lena put the Memphis records on the table. He read them. He asked his 3rd question, which was the one I'd been waiting for. "Mom knew?" Neither of us answered right away. He looked up from the papers and looked at me directly. He hadn't done that in a while. Looked at me directly the way he used to when he was a kid and needed a straight answer about something. I said yes. He put the papers down. He sat back in the chair. He looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "Where is she?" I don't know exactly what Nadine expected when she walked into the kitchen that evening. Maybe she expected a normal Friday dinner. Maybe some part of her suspected something was wrong. She'd come downstairs quietly, slowly, and she'd seen Lena's car in the driveway, but hadn't said anything. When she walked in and saw the 3 of us and the folder on the table and Harrison's face, she stopped in the doorway. She looked at me first. I don't know what she was looking for. I hope she found something useful. I didn't say anything. Harrison asked her to sit down. She sat down. I won't tell you every word of what was said. That part belongs to my family, and even now I protect it. But I will tell you that Nadine didn't deny it. Not the affair, not knowing about Brooke's history, not knowing before the engagement, before Harrison proposed, before any of this. What she said, the part I'll carry with me, is that she thought it didn't matter, that Brooke made Harrison happy, that the past was the past, that she'd convinced herself that if she just didn't say anything, it would all work out. Harrison said, quietly, "You let me almost marry someone you knew was lying to me, because you didn't want to deal with the consequences of telling the truth." Nadine didn't answer. He stood up. He picked up his bag from the hallway. He said he was going to a hotel and that he'd call when he was ready. He stopped at the door and looked at me, just for a second. Then he left. I won't tell you the story is over, because it isn't. Harrison called off the engagement the following week. He called Brooke from the hotel. I don't know exactly what he said. He told me it was short. He said she didn't argue much. I think she understood that she'd been seen. Nadine and I, that's a longer story. I won't wrap it up with a bow, because it doesn't have one yet. We're in counseling, both individual and together. I won't tell you I've forgiven her, because I'm still working on what that word means to me. I will tell you that 31 years is a very long time, and that I'm not a man who walks away from structures easily, but I'm also learning, slowly, later in life than I'd like, that some structures need to be rebuilt from the foundation. The wedding venue gave back 60% of the deposit. Lena handled that. The invitations had already gone out, so Harrison had to make a lot of phone calls. He did it, every single one. I offered to help. He said he needed to do it himself, and I understood that. A month after everything happened, Harrison came by the house on a Sunday. We didn't plan it, he just showed up. I was on the porch reading. He sat down in the other chair, and we watched the backyard for a while without saying anything. The maple tree was fully orange by then. Peak color, the kind of thing you drive out to see in the Smoky Mountains, and we had it right in the backyard. After a while, he said, "You knew before you told me, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. I said yes. I told him how long. I told him I'd been trying to do it right, to gather what we needed, to not blow everything up before we were ready. I told him I was sorry it took as long as it did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I get it. He stopped. "I needed to know you were on my side." I said, "I have always been on your side, from before you knew there were sides." He nodded once. We went back to watching the tree. After a while, he said, "I planted something under that tree when I was a kid." I said, "A pine cone." He turned and looked at me. "You remember that?" I said. "I remember everything." He looked at the tree for a long time. Then slowly, that laugh came out of him. The one that starts uncertain, like it isn't sure it's allowed yet. I recognized it immediately. He got it from his mother. But it belongs to him now. I'm not the kind of man who has lessons to hand out. I don't think what happened to my family is a story with a moral. It's just a story about what happens when people stop telling the truth to the people they love and start telling it only to themselves. What I'll say is this: 64 years old, I'm still learning what it means to be a father. I'm learning that being present isn't the same as being watchful, that a person can document everything in his head and still miss the moment when someone needed him to just say something. I'm learning that my daughter inherited my patience and used it better than I ever did. And I'm learning that a maple tree planted 33 years ago, in good shoes, by a man who didn't quite know what he was doing but knew he needed something to come home to, that tree will outlast most of what we think is permanent. I don't know what holds and what doesn't anymore, but I'm still here, and so is the tree. I spent 30 years calculating how much weight a bridge could hold before it failed. I was good at it. I never lost a structure. But I nearly lost my son to something I saw coming and said nothing about. That's the part I keep returning to, even now, months later, when things have quieted down and the house feels different in ways I'm still getting used to. There's a version of this story where I do nothing, where I go back upstairs that August night, put the water glass on the nightstand, and decide that what I saw wasn't what I saw, where I let Harrison walk down the aisle in October, marry a woman whose entire backstory was constructed to get her somewhere comfortable, and only find out later, years later, maybe, what had been underneath it the whole time. That version exists. I could have lived in it. I almost did. What stopped me wasn't courage. I want to be honest about that. What stopped me was Lena. She did what I'd been trained my whole life to do, and somehow forgot to apply at home. She looked at the evidence. She followed the inconsistencies. She didn't let her feelings about what she wanted to be true get in front of what actually was true. She was 30 years old, and she did that more cleanly than I did at 64. I'm her father, and I'm telling you she is the reason this story ended the way it did. I think about Nadine a lot. I think about the choice she made, which was the choice not to choose. She knew who Brooke was. She knew what Harrison didn't know. And somewhere along the way, she decided that silence was neutral, that not saying something wasn't the same as doing harm. That's the lie people tell themselves when the truth is too uncomfortable to carry. Silence isn't neutral. It takes sides. It just does it quietly enough that the person holding it can pretend otherwise. What happened to Nadine wasn't punishment from anywhere outside herself. It was the natural result of a decision she made and then repeated every single day for months. Every dinner, every wedding planning conversation, every time Harrison called excited about his future, each of those was a moment she chose again. That's how these things work. Not one catastrophic decision, but 100 small ones. Each one a little easier than the last because the previous one already moved the line. And Brooke. I don't know what shaped her into a person who could do what she did. I genuinely don't. I'm not interested in reducing her to a villain because I don't think that explains anything useful. What I know is that she built something on ground that wasn't hers and the ground gave way. That's not fate. That's physics. Harrison asked me once, after everything settled, whether I was angry. I told him I was something, but I wasn't sure anger was the right word for it. Grief, maybe. The particular kind that comes not from losing something, but from realizing what you were looking at the whole time without understanding it. He said, "I feel like an idiot." I told him that the people most likely to be deceived are the ones who lead with trust. That's not stupidity. That's a quality worth protecting, even after something like this. Especially after something like this. He didn't say anything, but he nodded in a way that told me he heard it. I planted that maple tree because I needed something to come home to. I didn't know at the time that the truest thing about that impulse was the need itself. The recognition that a life has to be built around something real, something with roots, something that doesn't change its nature based on what's convenient. I'm 64 years old, still learning what holds.